Welcome to our study in Nehemiah. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 2, and I want to begin like I usually do with a question. Do you believe one person can make a difference in the world? And if you do, I want you to take a moment just to think of a few names of individuals that you know have made a difference. Maybe some of these names came to your mind. What about Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Peter, Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, Wilberforce, or more recently, Billy Graham, Mother Teresa. And actually the list goes on and on. But what about someone like the woman at the well? You know, she was chosen by our Lord to take the gospel to the Samaritans. This sort of woman whose background was sketchy, and yet Jesus chose her. You know, the promise from God is that all things are possible to those who believe. To those who believe. That means from the weakest of us to the strongest of us, all things are possible. And Jesus said, living faith can move mountains in Matthew 17:20. So if you believe those things, if you believe that one person can make a difference in the world and that faith can move mountains, then why do you think most of us as Christians fail to be involved in the great work of God? What do you think is the reason for that? Is it because we actually have a lack of faith, a lack of belief in the promises of God? Well, we're going to look at Nehemiah today, and we're going to look specifically at his faith and what that faith propelled him to do. Last week when we looked at Nehemiah, we saw that he cared, he wept, he prayed, he fasted, and then he acted. But today we're going to examine the fact that he had faith. And as we begin, we're going to look at the fact that he had the faith to wait. Starting in verses 1 through 3 in chapter 2. And it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you're not sick?" I replied to the king, "This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was suddenly very much afraid, and I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face, though, not be sad, when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire?" So we see that time had passed between where we are today and what we looked at last week. The month of Nisan, it's our mid-March to mid-April, and the conversation that Nehemiah had had with his brother took place in the month of December. So this indicated that about 4 months have passed since Nehemiah received bad news. And during that time, he's been in prayer, he's been fasting, and we're also going to see over the next few verses that God has had him in the midst of working, in the midst of researching what God's going to call him to do. You know, Hebrews chapter 6 verse 12 says that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those through faith and patience inherit the promises. How long do you and I give God when waiting for answered prayer before we give up and dismiss that request or idea? Do we wait months? Do we wait years? Or are we only allowing God days and hours to respond? In Psalm 46 verse 10, we're admonished to be still and know that I am God. In James 5:7, it says, "Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord." Are you patient? Are you still waiting for Jesus' return? It's been 2,000 years. Are you still waiting, or have you given up? And we also see in verse 8, to be patient, strengthen your heart, for the coming of the Lord is at hand, and it's been 2,000 years. Warren Wiersbe said this in his commentary: when you wait on the Lord in prayer, you're not wasting your time, you're investing it. God is preparing both you and your circumstances so that his purposes will be accomplished. However, when the right time arrives for us to act, by faith, we dare not delay. God's in control. He's in charge. He's in charge of the time, and he's also in charge of and in control of the individuals involved in accomplishing his will. And that's one of the evidences that we see in how King Artaxerxes responds. God is in control. And obviously, Nehemiah walks into the presence of the king. His concerns are written all over his face. Now, you always sheltered or tried to shelter a king from bad news or from your personal problems. So the king, this is very serious, that Nehemiah looked sad in his presence, and the king could have had Nehemiah dismissed and could have had him put away, but instead King Artaxerxes asked him about his sadness. And as I look at that and look at how God acts in Artaxerxes' life, how God uses Artaxerxes to accomplish his plan, we realize that world leaders are only God's servants, whether they know it or not. Let that bring comfort to you. World leaders are only God's servants, whether they know it or not. In Romans 13:1, Paul writes, "Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God." So the king asked Nehemiah, "Why are you sad?" And we see that this is serious because Nehemiah is suddenly afraid. And he may be afraid because he's remembering something that had happened earlier. In the book of Ezra, chapter 4, verses 8 through 23, we see that King Artaxerxes is the one who ordered the rebuilding of Jerusalem stopped. And so, as Nehemiah's mind may be racing at that time, he realizes he's about to enter into dangerous territory with what he's going to request of the king. But he has waited. He has waited on God for God's perfect timing. And Nehemiah begins very carefully. He says, "Let the king live forever." He's acknowledging the king's authority, power, and he's giving him the respect he owes. Nehemiah is also a diplomat. When you and I are about to ask for something that is controversial, is it better for us to be diplomatic or just demand what we want? Think about as children, we frequently walk in and demand what we want from our parents, and it does not go well. Well, Nehemiah respected the king. He sought to work within the bounds and lines of authority that existed in the empire. He didn't run in and say, "I've got this commission from the Lord to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going whether you like it or not." When it comes to matters of conscience, we must always obey God rather than men. We see this in Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Peter and the apostles say those very words, we must obey God rather than men. But even then we have to show respect for authority. Peter chapter 2, verse 11 through 25, he writes, "Submit yourselves therefore to every human institution, whether to a king or as to governors." And Daniel and his friends also did this when they came before King Nebuchadnezzar. They requested, but they showed authority and respect for the king's position, but they also, when it came to matters of conscience, were obedient to God. So Nehemiah has the faith to wait on God to lead and tell him when to go. But he also has the faith to ask in the midst of this very uncomfortable and somewhat scary situation. Starting in verse 4, the king asked, "What would you request?" So I replied, and I prayed to the God of heaven, and I asked, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. And I said to the king, "If it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortresses which are by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go. And the king granted them to me, because the good hand of my God was on me. In a book I read not long ago, this scenario in Nehemiah was put in a more modern day context, with the author saying this: do you realize what he was really asking the Persian monarch to do? He was not only asking for the privilege to go and rebuild an enemy city, he was also asking that the Persians pay the bill. It would be like me taking a letter from the Israeli Knesset to the Iranian president and asking him to donate a piece of land to Israel and pay for the establishment of an Israeli colony to be built there, complete with defenses. That's how serious, that's how humanly impossible this ask was. But with God, we know all things are possible. And notice that Nehemiah, in the midst of the ask, lifts up a prayer. We might call this a breath prayer, because he says in verse 4, so I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king. So this wasn't the prayer that he'd been kneeling. He didn't suddenly drop to his knees and spend time in prayer in the presence of the king. He lifted up a quick, oh help, Father, prayer. And you and I are familiar with that. Those emergency prayers. But Nehemiah's emergency prayer was backed up with months of praying in advance. Also, it's important to notice that Nehemiah had a plan. He was ready with answers and the specifics. Send me. And he said how long. He gave him the specifics of how long it would take. And he also gave the king specifics on what he would need. He knew his opponents. He knew what his opposition would be. So he asked the king for letters of authority to provide safe travel and to provide the materials needed for construction. Nehemiah had done his research well during those 4 months of prayer and fasting, and that research was done under the guidance of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Well, the king grants Nehemiah's request, but he grants that request specifically because of the good hand of God. Now, you and I expect God to work through a believer like Nehemiah, but we forget that God can also work through unbelievers to accomplish his will. Here we're looking at King Artaxerxes, but think about that in other past examples. Pharaoh or Cyrus, who he used to deliver his people. And another thing to note here is that God prepared a person before he implemented a program. There's a sequence that's important. It's a sequence for success. God calls a person, equips him to respond to the need. Now, here on staff at Guntersville First Methodist, we have a tendency to get an idea, jump out front, and run with it before oftentimes we've ever spent time, sometimes months, maybe even years, in prayer before our King of Kings and Lord of Lords, waiting for his lead. But we also plan programs or actions, and then we start looking for the people to lead it. And that is a recipe for hardship, for burnout, and sometimes for disaster. So he had the patience to wait. He had the faith to wait. He had the faith to ask. But he also has the faith to go. He says, then I came to the governors of the provinces beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent me with officers of the army and horsemen. And when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. He's about to disrupt their plans. They are the ones in authority and the ones calling the shots, and now someone else is going to come in and say, well, I have this letter from the king, and it's going to change their plans. Nehemiah is faced with several very powerful enemies. Sanballat is the governor of Samaria, and he is a Horonite, which is also connected to the Moabites and the city of Moab. And Tobiah the Ammonite is one of Sanballat's informants. Tobiah was related in marriage to many of Nehemiah's co-workers and co-laborers, and he had a number of family and friends among the Jews, and he would use them to gather inside information and then take that information back to Sanballat. The third enemy that we're going to meet later on is Geshem, an Arabian. And it's thought that Sanballat was hoping that he would eventually be made governor of Judah as well as Samaria. And Sanballat's daughter was married into the family of the high priest. So you're going to see that the enemies had infiltrated the family of God. So Nehemiah has the faith to go, but he also has the faith to be patient. Once he gets there, he doesn't just automatically rush in. He says this, "So I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. The trip from Susa to Jerusalem was a journey of about 2 months. And I arose in the night, and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem, and there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well and on to the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem which were broken down and its gates which were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up at night by the ravine and inspected the wall. Then I entered the valley gate and returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work." So this is important. In this section, we see the patience of Nehemiah. He didn't rush into his work, but he patiently gathers facts firsthand and then plans his strategy. You know, leaders are often awake when others are not, and when others are asleep, and they're often working when others are resting. And by keeping this investigation to himself and just a few very close friends, he prevented Tobiah's cohorts from getting information that they could pass along to Sanballat. Well, as Nehemiah surveys the area, the destruction is much worse than he could have imagined. The ground around the king's pool was so covered with debris that the horse he was riding could not get by. J.C. Muir states in his commentary, this is testimony of the thoroughness of Nebuchadnezzar's demolition of the walls of Jerusalem. Now you and I would look at that and we'd see such a mess, and our minds would go, how in the world are we going to get this rubble removed and out of here? But unlike what we might do, Nehemiah looks at it and he sees opportunity. He sees building material and lots of it. He just needs now to gather together the manpower. So we see now that he has the faith to challenge others. Verse 17, "Then I said to them, you see the bad situation we're in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire, but come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words, which he had spoken to me. Then they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work." He pours his heart out to the Jewish leaders and makes sure that they know that God was with them and that God was going to enable them to do the work. God already proved that he was in this. He'd already proved his power by working in the heart of the king, and the king had promised to meet their needs. How do you and I go about enlisting others to help with the work God's laid on our hearts to be involved in? Can you point to the hand of God in the plan? And if not, if you can't point to the hand of God in the plan, then why in the world do we try and attempt to go forward with it? And something else to note too is that these Jewish officials responded immediately and accepted the challenge. They were not controlled by the fact that they had been stopped once before. They did not say, hey, we tried this once and it didn't work, why try again? Or don't rock the boat, you'll arouse the enemies against us. Someone once defined leadership as the art of getting people to do what they ought to do because they want to do it. So he has the faith to challenge others. Nehemiah also had the faith to handle the opposition. Verse 19, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard it, they mocked us and despised us and said, what is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? So I answered them and said, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. Have you noticed that just as soon as God's people step out in faith to do the will of God, the enemy shows up and tries to discourage them? And a new opponent is mentioned here. I mentioned him earlier, Geshem, an Arabian, also sometimes called Gashmu. Some contemporary inscriptions cite the name as that of a king or chief of the Kedar, a nomadic or Bedouin tribe that's mentioned in Isaiah and Jeremiah. So Nehemiah has several choices here in how he can deal with these verbal attacks. He could ignore them. He could debate with the enemy and try to convince them that they're wrong. And he could also ask them to join in on the project, but he doesn't do any of these. In that last statement, verse 20, he says, but you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. So he is not asking them, not inviting them to be a part of this rebuilding. Now, not everyone we're going to see is going to agree with Nehemiah's decisions. And we're going to see that as time goes on, some of those that have said, hey, we're ready to rebuild, we're ready to join you in this process, some of them will cooperate with Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. But Nehemiah resolutely stands his ground, reaffirming that God is going to give them success. This is God's project. As leaders, as followers of God, do we have a burden in our hearts for the work that God has called us to do? What work has God called you to do? It may not be something as monumental as building a wall. Maybe the work God has called you to do is sharing Jesus with your grandchildren. Maybe the work that God has called you to do in this season is to be a caregiver. That's certainly monumental. Do we have a burden in our hearts for the work God's called us to do? Are we willing to sacrifice in order to see his will accomplished? No matter that work he's called us to do, no matter what it is. Are we willing to sacrifice to see that it's accomplished and accomplished well? Are we patient in gathering facts and planning our work? Do we enlist the help of others or do we try to do everything ourselves? Do we motivate people on the basis of the spiritual, what God is doing, or do we motivate people on the basis of what it can do for me? Are we following the Lord? Are we following the Lord? Are we letting him lead us? And as followers, do we listen to what our leaders say as they share their burdens? Do we cling to the past or desire to see God do something new? Do we put our hands and necks to the work of God's plan? Are we cooperating in any way with the enemy and weakening the work that's God's called us and his people to do? And most importantly, have we found the job that God wants us to complete? A lot of questions we can ask ourselves coming out of this small chapter. But the faith that Nehemiah had is faith that you and I can have today because we serve the same God. He had the faith to wait. He had the faith to ask. He had the faith to go. He had the faith to be patient. He had the faith to challenge others. And he had the faith to handle the opposition. What can be said about our faith? Lord, I just ask that you just bless us, Father, strengthen us, well up in us with the faith of your mighty hand, Father, so that we can be your faithful servants in your work. And all the glory and the praise belongs to you. Amen.